and my dad went to Cincinnati, which is kind of the flagship campus, and I went to New York. But before I did that, when I was coming out of college and, utterly clueless as to what I was supposed to do next, my father told me about this organization in Washington, D.C. called the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, which was essentially a public voice of the values of the Reform Jewish movement, the stated positions of the Reform Jewish movement. And it's an advocacy office, political advocacy office. They work on civil rights, and they work on religious liberty issues, and a whole range of issues. And they had an internship program for other young Jews who were coming out of college without any clue what they really wanted to do. And this way, you could put something in your resume even though you were clueless. That sounded perfect to me. So I went to DC, and while I was there, I was exposed to Judaism in a way I hadn't been before. And I'm not sure why it was. It's a conversation for another time. Why I didn't grow up kind of, tasting a little more of the Jewish diversity of Portland, such as it was in the 70s. But coming to Washington, D.C., because there were other kids there. When I say kids, I mean college grads, mostly from the Reform movement, but there were a couple of kids from other movements. And so this was really the first time I had a chance to talk in depth with these with Jews from other movements, and I had a particular experience on one Friday night. I won't go into the details of just becoming aware that there were all of these traditions that I wanted to know more about, and that had not been part of my upbringing. So again, I felt very, very strong Jewish identity, very strong Jewish knowledge in terms of, in particular in terms of social justice, and that's what had motivated me to come to this office. And that was, directly a link from my father, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment. But I began to become curious about aspects of the tradition that were not part of my upbringing, and I began to do an enormous amount of learning about the tradition, and early on what became an ambition for me, and I don't know if I articulated it to myself or if I just realized this, years after. It was my ambition by the time I was in my early to mid-20s to never feel out of place in any Jewish setting. So I wanted to become so, even though I was proud as a Reform Jew, I wanted to become so knowledgeable and comfortable with different traditions, that even if they weren't part of my everyday practice, that I could walk into any shul in the world and feel at home. And that's largely the case. I'm not talking about Mea Shearim or the Breslauer Shul in Spot, which I love very much, but I can't claim to be at home in the Haredi world, but for the most part. So that early on, there was this desire to reclaim parts of my tradition. And a question that I think is illustrative of differences in our generations. When you ask me why I wanted to go to my grandfather's, to my great-grandfather's shul, your grandfather's shul, to me, it's so self-evident that there's just not even a question. Well, because that's where I come from, and I wanted to recover that. And I think that one thing that I think is so interesting, and this is not just the case among Jews, I think it's true of people of all kinds of different ethnic and religious backgrounds. Among people of my generation, there's been a need, or a felt need, to rediscover our roots and to reconnect to them in a way that I think was not as alive for your generation, just because of different cultural shifts and changes. In fact, I think in your generation, the movement was I don't mean the Jewish movement, the trajectory for Americans with a so-called ethnic background was to kind of figure out how that could be made to fit into the mainstream. And I think in my generation, it was much more common, for better or for worse, to kind of reconnect to your roots and to separate yourself from the mainstream so you could have a tradition that you could claim as your own. And I think I was kind of caught up in this broad cultural movement to do that, which has affected every single movement. It's affected the Jews in the Reform movement, conservative movement, Reconstructionist movement, and it's affected Jews in the Orthodox movement. If you think that Orthodoxy is unchanged over the last 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years, because often we perceive like it's been unchanged since the destruction of the temple. It's completely not true. So everybody has been affected by this tendency in the West, not just America, but in Europe as well, to kind of reclaim our roots, and it plays out in different ways. So for me, it's just so self-evident. So my dad said that right before I was ordained as a Reform rabbi, like literally the day before, so the ordination must have been on a Sunday, because I think we went down on Shabbos to what is now known as the Stanton Street Shul, which is on which street? Very good. Just want to see if you're paying attention. It's on Stanton Street. So when my great-grandfather, blessed memory, was the rabbi there, it was called Anshe Berjan, the Shul of Anshe Berjan, the people of Berjan. So my family came from where? Berjan. I love you guys. Even Chana, like, obediently was like, Berjan. Very good. I'm so proud of you. So, we came from Berjan, and that's how shuls used to have the name of where the community was from. So my great-grandfather was the rabbi of Anshe Berjan, and so the community wanted him to come over so that they could have a rav. He came over a couple of years before the rest of his family, and he established the shul, which is still standing. And there's a big plaque in the big Knesset, in the sanctuary, that says, in honor of Morenu, Rabbeinu, our rabbi, our teacher, this lovely, all this honorific language. I have a picture of the plaque somewhere, and then it has his name, Rabbi Emanuel Rose, and also his wife's name, my great-grandmother's name as well. And yeah, they gave us an aliyah, they gave us special honor. The rabbi at that time was a guy named Rabbi Joshua, or I don't know how to pronounce it, but he's a brilliant young rabbi, and actually he's got a great website for those who want to learn from this guy. He's great. It's called Utopia. Why Utopia? Because his last name is Yutter, so Yutter. Anyway, so look him up. So he was the rabbi, and he gave us, an aliyah and a lovely honor, and it was really great and a special connection. But to me, it was just self-evident. This is where I come from, and I want to reclaim that, and I want to know where I come from, and I want to know who this was. So I was just in New York for this conference at Mechon Hadar, which many of you have heard me refer to, a wonderful center of Jewish learning. And when I was there, I went up to downtown to meet a friend of mine, and we went to the Lower East Side, and we walked by the Stanton Street Shul, and I took a picture, as I do every time I'm down there, me in front of the building. It's just very powerful and very special. So let me return to my trajectory. Maybe we can use this to segue into the next phase. So already when I was at HUC, when I was at Hebrew Union College in New York, again, Reform Seminary, I already felt a little bit of discomfort and tension. I don't mean like tension like I was having fights with people, but it didn't quite feel like it fit. It didn't quite feel like it was my home, intellectually, spiritually, religiously. I loved the professors. I had incredible professors. David Ellenson, who at that time was the president of the school, and the dean of the New York campus, Norman Cohen, and I could go on and on, all the wonderful teachers. But substantively, I felt like there were things that I wanted to learn that weren't being taught. There wasn't enough halakha, there wasn't enough Jewish law. There wasn't, for me, and their Gemara, Talmud was not a focus. And also my colleagues, the other rabbinic students, didn't seem to be captivated and fascinated by the tradition in the way that I was. And I already had a sense that in some way I was probably more likely a conservative Jew. I already was aware of that in my second year of rabbinical school. But in any event, it felt like a creative tension for me. It felt like it was okay, but there's some fancy French word that starts with an F that describes this. Isn't there? Anyway, I looked to my parents, my auntie and my mom, but I felt like there was some kind of creative tension, and friction was good there. That there was distance between me and the movement, but that we could make something out of it. So that's why I stayed in there. Over time, I just became kind of obsessed with I just wanted to be able to talk to the rabbis of the last 2,000 years. And so I would go to school, I'd go to my classes, and then I would come home, and Hannah can testify to this, or attest to this, that I would just read. I would just read Jewish concentration. I would just sit down and read for like 9 hours at a time until I was exhausted and I'd go to sleep. And I just wanted to be able to, anything that I read, I felt like anything that I see in Hebrew, it belongs to me. There's nothing that is not mine because I'm a Reformed Jew. And there's no such thing as an Orthodox text or whatever. Those boundaries are nonsense, and I continue to believe that. And so I just wanted to soak it all in and become fluent with everything that I could. I wanted just to understand and to be taught by these rabbis. And so, over little by little, I began to just sense an increasing distance from my peers in terms of what our interests were. And then the last thing I'll say, and then maybe you can talk about when you actually became a rabbi and what your trajectory was. I was really feeling a thirst for halakha. I was seeing the need personally, but also ideologically or theologically, whatever the word is, in the need for Jewish law as a foundation, which is not where I came from. So again, I felt very proud of the legacy of Reformed Judaism. I felt like the Reformed Jewish world was still the right place for me because of the values of Reformed Judaism. But I began to feel this sense that my life was going to need a foundation of halakha, of Jewish law. And just to be clear for folks who don't know, and I'll use this to hand off to my dad, and maybe he can talk about his trajectory from rabbinical school, that the Reform movement is not a halachic movement, right? And that's not, God forbid, some denigration or criticism of it. It doesn't claim to be a halachic movement. It claims to be a movement that is informed by Jewish law and Jewish tradition, but where personal conscience and individual autonomy can override the dictates of the halachic, of the Jewish legal tradition. So it doesn't proclaim or pretend to be a halachic movement, whereas the Orthodox movement and the conservative movement do claim to have the Jewish law as the foundation of Jewish individual and communal practice. So when I say that I was looking for a halachic or Jewish legal foundation, that's what I'm talking about. I was in an environment where that was not the norm, that was not what people were seeking, but I began to sense that that's what I was kind of hungry for in my experience. So that I'll stop at rabbinical school, which is where you stopped, and maybe you can continue on the next trajectory.
Yes, it really is fascinating to listen to you talk about what you went through. At any rate, after I was ordained, before I was ordained, I was, for my last 2 years of rabbinic school, I became the director, co-director of the Hebrew Union College Summer School, because I had a very good Hebrew background, superb Hebrew background, and I was one of the few teachers there who taught the entrance students beginning Hebrew, essentially, in their summer before entering school. So, from that time, after I was ordained, which was quite common, we looked for assistantships, be assistant rabbi someplace. And I went to Temple Emanuel in New York City. There were 3 rabbis there. The senior rabbi was Dr. Julius Mark, Nathan Perman was the associate rabbi, and I was the assistant rabbi. Largest Jewish congregation in the world. And it has an incredible building, which is on 5th and 65th Street. If any of you ever find yourself there, go in and take a look at that building. It's incredible. Now, in those days...
Let me just frame that a little more for people, just so people understand. And, it says a lot about how low we've come as a generation that I have to use this analogy for people to understand. But this was the equivalent of somebody coming out of like business school and becoming like a vice president at Facebook. Like at that time, Temple Emanuel was like the congregation that was the congregation in the Reform world. And so my father sort of not quite spelling that out. So he came out of rabbinical school, kind of had like the coveted position for a recent, for a newly minted rabbi. Onward.
And I want to describe the image of the place, because it really gives you a picture of some part of the Reform movement in those days, those early days. We did not wear...
Sorry, what?
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Can you comment on what year around?
Oh yeah, what year were you ordained?
I was ordained in 1957.
Thank you.
So I was in New York for 1957 to 1960. Now here's the description of the place. It's a huge, magnificent synagogue, style which doesn't exist anyplace else in the world. Services, the big service was on Saturday morning. Friday also was a very important service, was broadcast on radio. Didn't have television in those days. Broadcast on radio. And it was a beautiful service. It began at 5:15 and ended at 6 o'clock.
That's how it's done, man. That's tight.
Yeah, that's true. And
Now the Chazan can understand why I'm always like nudging him to let's keep this thing tight.
Shabbat morning was the major service, and it drew people from all over the city, and Jewish visitors from out of state always wanted to go to Temple Emanuel for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was to hear great preaching. And they did when they came to Emmanuel. They heard great preaching. Now, here's the image. This huge, beautiful pulpit. And there are the three rabbis in robes, no talitot, no kippah. Okay? Now, there was many Reform congregations. I never did a survey as to how many. There were some that were many, I should say, that were more traditional. So that, for example, I once was a student rabbi in Baltimore, Maryland, and I was invited to speak to two different Reform congregations there, and one was so much more traditional. They always wore talitot and kippot, and the other congregation, they didn't. It's just an interesting kind of a mix. So, but at Emmanuel, it was called a classical Reform congregation, and that's what it was. And at the end of the service, big crowds. We used to march down the aisle like soldiers.
Like dignitaries.
Yeah, boom, boom, boom. Well, way down the aisle, a long while. And then people came by and said, Good Shabbos. They knew that phrase. And it was a wonderful experience for me. I officiated at so many weddings in New York City. It was so funny. I didn't know these people well at all, obviously, but after Dr. Mark and Dr. Perlman wore out their wedding day, then it came my turn, and I picked up the rest of them, and I used to, literally, on a Sunday, I used to go along 59th Street, from hotel to hotel.
For the different wedding receptions?
Yeah, sure. And the last stop was always the Plaza Hotel. I think maybe some of you have seen that one. But that's what it was like. Okay. So I had a wonderful learning experience at Emanuel because while I was taught well how to write sermons in school, it was a great learning experience for me. I had to give a sermon every Shabbat morning through the summer. Every Shabbat morning through the summer. That is a job, let me tell you, because the formula that we had in those days was 1 hour of preparation for every spoken minute. 1 hour of preparation for every spoken minute. And that was the formula of the great preachers of that time, Dr. Abba Hillel Silver, you've heard of his name, Solomon Freehoff, and a bunch of other great rabbis who were known for their sermons. And there was a lot of great emphasis on sermons in Reform Judaism in those days. And
I'm sure the congregants appreciated that because it's a real incentive to keep the sermons short. But
20 minutes. No, I think Freehoff and Silver gave our lectures. Actually, I'm glad I mentioned that Silver because his service was on Sunday morning. It wasn't called a Shabbat service, but it was the major service, and it was on a Sunday morning. And so then, while I was in New York, it reached a point where it was time for me to move on, and I wanted to have my own congregation. So along came this opportunity of Beth Israel in Portland, and we have a whole placement system that works. And the congregation would let the group know that they wanted a rabbi, and rabbis would apply, send in their apps, and so on and so forth. Finally, I ended up as the rabbi here of Beth Israel. Now, let me tell you, the first year or two were a nightmare. And the reason why is because every time I made a suggestion as to a new idea, the board said no. So I finally said to them, you know, you wanted a young man to come in with new ideas and do new things. I mean, what's the point? So the president in the third year changed things. He literally changed them. He said, and he began influencing how the board thought. The board became younger, and then 46 and a half years later, I retired, and now I can't believe it's another 14 years beyond that.
I hope that there are no board members here from that original